Simon Ashford, Duke of Wexley, spent the better part of a year convinced his own stepmother was working, quietly and deliberately, to destroy his marriage, watching her exclude his wife from household decisions, intercept private correspondence, and meet in secret with a man Simon did not recognize, gathering evidence in his own mind for a betrayal he intended to confront the moment he had proof enough to act on it. He finally confronted her on a winter evening, with every intention of ordering her from his house for good. He learned, in the space of that single terrible conversation, that the woman he had spent a year suspecting had actually been spending that entire year quietly, secretly, fighting to save the very marriage he believed she was trying to destroy. Before we get into how it started, this is a brand new channel, and if you love a story where the villain you were certain of turns out to be the person fighting hardest in the shadows, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the reveal. Now, here's how it began. Simon Ashford had never fully trusted his stepmother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice, in the 8 years since his own father had married her, a distrust rooted less in anything Beatrice had actually done, and more in the particular, wounded suspicion of a young man who had watched his own beloved mother die when he was 17, only to see his father remarry within 2 years to a woman scarcely a decade older than Simon himself. He remembered, with a clarity that had never once faded, the particular grief of that transition, watching his father move through the halls of a house still filled with his mother's belongings, with a new wife on his arm, and understanding, with the raw and unfair certainty of a 17-year-old boy's grief, that his father's apparent happiness felt like a betrayal of the woman he had genuinely, desperately mourned. Beatrice had been 26 at the time of the marriage, a widow of modest means whose own first husband had died, leaving her considerably worse off than her genuine breeding suggested she deserved, and Simon, in the raw grief of his mother's loss, had decided, with the particular unfair certainty of a young man's wounded heart, that Beatrice's evident fondness for his father could only be a calculated performance in service of the considerable fortune and title she stood to gain by it. He had watched her, across the following years, manage the household with a genuine warmth and competence that ought, by any fair measure, to have gradually earned his trust, and had instead interpreted every kindness as further evidence of a patient, long-term scheme, his own grief having calcified, somewhere in those early years, into a suspicion he had never once genuinely questioned. His father had died some 4 years into that second marriage, leaving Beatrice a dowager duchess, with a generous but carefully structured settlement that kept her comfortably situated at Wexley Hall without granting her any genuine authority over the estate itself, an arrangement Simon's own father had apparently designed, in his final illness, specifically to protect his son's eventual inheritance from any possibility of Beatrice's undue influence, a precaution that had only deepened Simon's own long-held suspicion that his father, too, had harbored some private doubt about his second wife's genuine loyalty. Beatrice had remained at Wexley Hall in the years since, managing her own considerably reduced sphere of household affairs with a quiet, careful competence that Simon had never once genuinely appreciated, having decided, years earlier, that whatever warmth she showed the household was simply the practiced performance of a woman determined to maintain her comfortable position for as long as possible. Simon married Margaret Colville 3 years after his father's death, a match born of genuine affection rather than any strategic calculation, Margaret's own family possessing a modest but perfectly respectable fortune that made the union entirely unremarkable by the standards of their circle, and the early years of the marriage passed with a warmth that Simon, watching it, privately credited to his own careful management of the household, rather than to any particular grace on his stepmother's part. It was in the marriage's 3rd year, as the warmth of those early years began, almost imperceptibly, to strain beneath a tension Simon could not immediately identify, that he first began noticing what he came to understand, with a growing and increasingly bitter certainty, as his stepmother's deliberate campaign against his wife. The tension began, in its earliest and most innocent form, with small, seemingly minor frictions in the household's daily management, Beatrice countermanding several of Margaret's instructions to the staff, regarding a planned renovation of the East Wing, insisting, with a firmness Simon found genuinely puzzling, given her own limited authority in such matters, that the work be delayed indefinitely, without offering any explanation beyond a vague, unsatisfying reference to the household's finances, requiring careful attention elsewhere. Margaret, wounded by what she experienced as a genuine undermining of her own position as mistress of the house, brought the matter to Simon with a hurt confusion that Simon, watching his wife's genuine distress, found himself absorbing as confirmation of exactly the suspicion he had carried toward Beatrice for years. There was a particular evening, not long after the renovation dispute, when Margaret returned from an afternoon call, visibly shaken, having overheard, through no fault of her own, two of the household's senior servants discussing in hushed tones the unusual frequency of the Dowager Duchess's recent private correspondence and the equally unusual sums she had apparently been withdrawing from her own household allowance. Margaret relayed the overheard gossip to Simon that same evening, and Simon, already primed by weeks of his own accumulating suspicion, found the second-hand servant's gossip landing with considerably more weight than it likely deserved, another small brick added to the wall of certainty he was steadily constructing against his stepmother. The pattern deepened across the following months in ways that struck Simon as increasingly deliberate. Beatrice began declining invitations to social engagements that included Margaret, offering excuses of ill health that Simon, observing his stepmother's evident continued vigor in every other aspect of her daily life, found himself unable to fully credit. She grew noticeably cooler in her direct conversations with Margaret, the easy warmth that had characterized their earlier acquaintance, replaced by a careful, guarded distance that Margaret herself found increasingly painful and increasingly difficult to understand, given how genuinely fond of Beatrice she had grown across the marriage's early years. And it was Simon's own discovery, quite by accident, of a series of unexplained payments drawn from the estate's accounts under Beatrice's own authorization, sums considerable enough to raise genuine questions, but never quite large enough to demand immediate explanation, that finally convinced him his stepmother's campaign extended beyond mere social coldness into something considerably more calculated. It was on an autumn afternoon, riding through the estate's own eastern boundary, that Simon witnessed the encounter that transformed his growing suspicion into something approaching certainty. He observed, from a distance that kept him unseen among the tree line, his stepmother meeting privately with a gentleman Simon did not recognize, a well-dressed but faintly disreputable-looking man whose conversation with Beatrice carried, even from Simon's considerable distance, an unmistakable tension, Beatrice's own posture rigid and guarded, in a manner Simon had genuinely never once witnessed from her across 8 years of acquaintance. He watched Beatrice hand the man a small, carefully wrapped parcel before the stranger departed on horseback, and rode home that evening with a cold, settled conviction that his stepmother was conspiring, for reasons he could not yet fully name, against the stability of his own marriage. What Simon did not know, having never once thought to ask his stepmother directly for an explanation before constructing his own damning narrative from the fragments available to him, was that Margaret carried a private history considerably more fraught than the comfortable, unremarkable courtship story Simon himself understood of her, a history that had, quite unexpectedly, resurfaced in the early months of the marriage's 3rd year, in a form that threatened to destroy everything Margaret and Simon had built together. Margaret had, at 19 years old, some 4 years before her marriage to Simon, formed an attachment to a charming, considerably older gentleman named Mr. Gerald Vance, a man who had courted her with a practiced, persuasive intensity that had very nearly led her, in a single reckless episode of youthful infatuation, to agree to a clandestine elopement before her own good sense, and a timely warning from a trusted family friend regarding Vance's considerable existing debts and questionable reputation, had led her to break off the arrangement before it could be carried through. She remembered, even across 4 intervening years and a genuinely happy marriage, the particular shame of that youthful infatuation, the way Vance had spoken to her with a flattering, focused attention, No other gentleman of her limited acquaintance had ever offered a girl of 19 with a merely modest fortune, and the considerable relief, mixed with lingering embarrassment, once her family friend's warning revealed precisely how calculated that attention had actually been. She had written Vance, in the raw emotional intensity of that youthful attachment, a series of letters considerably more compromising in their romantic candor than any young woman of her eventual respectable marriage would wish to see revealed, letters Vance had apparently kept, across the intervening years, against precisely the sort of opportunity that Margaret's eventual advantageous marriage to a duke now presented him. Vance had reappeared in Margaret's life, some months into the marriage's third year, calling upon her privately with a carefully worded threat, explaining that he found himself in considerable financial distress, and that Margaret's own letters, should they find their way into the wrong hands, particularly the hands of certain gossip columns eager for precisely such a scandal involving a duchess, would very likely prove ruinous to the marriage she had built. Margaret, terrified of the damage such exposure might do to Simon's own standing and to the marriage she genuinely treasured, and equally terrified of confessing the youthful indiscretion to a husband she feared might judge her considerably more harshly than the situation warranted, made the desperate decision to confide instead in Beatrice, the one member of the household whose own worldly experience and evident discretion suggested she might offer genuine counsel without the risk of destroying the marriage through Simon's own wounded pride. Beatrice, hearing Margaret's tearful confession, recognized Vance's particular brand of calculated threat with a clarity that arrived from bitter, personal experience she had never once shared with Simon across the whole of their acquaintance. Her own first husband, Mr. Frederick Wells, dead some years before her marriage to Simon's father, had succumbed not to illness, as the family's careful public account maintained, but to the shame and despair of a nearly identical blackmail scheme, a scheme Beatrice herself had discovered too late to prevent. She remembered, with a grief that had never once fully healed despite the many years since, the particular signs she had failed to properly read at the time: Frederick's growing withdrawal, his sleepless nights spent at his own writing desk, the small, unexplained sums quietly disappearing from their modest household accounts that she had assumed, in her own naivety, must simply be the ordinary cost of some business venture he had not yet troubled her with. She had discovered the truth only after his death, going through his private papers in the raw aftermath of the tragedy, finding the blackmailer's own letters detailing an old indiscretion from Frederick's own youth and the escalating demands that had, in the final weeks of his life, grown beyond anything his modest income could sustain, watching helplessly. In that terrible retrospective clarity, as her husband, unable to bear the threatened exposure of an old indiscretion, had taken his own life rather than face it, leaving Beatrice, a young widow, considerably reduced in circumstance, and carrying a private grief and guilt she had spent years learning to bury beneath her own careful, composed exterior. She had vowed, in the raw aftermath of that loss, standing over her husband's own grave with a fury and grief tangled together beyond any easy separation, that she would never again stand by and watch someone she cared for face such a threat, without doing everything in her power to intervene. And Margaret's tearful confession struck that old unhealed wound with a force that left Beatrice instantly, fiercely determined to protect her stepson's marriage, regardless of what personal cost the effort required. Beatrice began her own quiet campaign against Vance, with a discretion born of hard, painful experience, understanding that any clumsy or public intervention risked provoking exactly the exposure Margaret feared most. She countermanded Margaret's household instructions regarding the East Wing renovation not from any genuine objection to the work itself, but because the funds Margaret had allocated toward it were precisely the funds Beatrice needed to quietly divert toward Vance's mounting financial demands, a diversion she could not explain to Margaret without revealing the full extent of her own direct negotiations with the blackmailer. She declined social engagements alongside Margaret, specifically to create opportunities for her own private meetings with Vance, arranged at times and locations she could plausibly explain, should anyone ask, as attending to her own personal affairs. and the cool, guarded distance she maintained toward Margaret in their direct conversations was, in truth, a deliberate act of protective restraint, Beatrice fearing that any visible continued warmth between them might draw Simon's own attention toward exactly the connection she was desperately trying to keep concealed from him, for Margaret's own sake, until the threat could be fully neutralized. The gentleman Simon observed meeting Beatrice at the estate's eastern boundary was Vance himself, and the parcel Beatrice handed him that autumn afternoon contained a payment considerably smaller than his original demand, the product of weeks of careful, exhausting negotiation in which Beatrice had drawn on every ounce of her own hard-won worldly experience to convince Vance that continued extortion carried genuine risk to himself. Risk she made plain through careful, veiled references to connections within the magistracy that she was, in fact, quietly cultivating throughout that same period, specifically to build a genuine legal case against him should the payments alone fail to secure his permanent silence. It was this careful, dangerous campaign, invisible to Simon, and understood by him only through the damning fragments his own suspicion had assembled, that finally reached its crisis on the winter evening. Simon confronted his stepmother directly, having gathered what he believed constituted sufficient proof of her betrayal to demand she leave Wexley Hall for good. "I have watched you undermine my wife for the better part of a year," Simon said, finding Beatrice alone in her own private sitting room, his voice carrying a cold fury he had been nursing for weeks. "I have seen the payments from the estate accounts. I have seen you meeting privately with a man of clearly disreputable character. I do not know what precisely you hope to gain by destroying my marriage, but I will not stand by any longer and watch you attempt it under my own roof. You have watched a great many things, Simon, and understood almost none of them correctly," Beatrice said, her own composure already beginning to fray. "You have spent 8 years watching me with exactly this same suspicious attention, waiting, I sometimes think, for evidence that would finally confirm whatever cruel story you decided about me the very week your father proposed. I confess I am almost relieved to finally have the accusation spoken aloud, rather than endured silently in every cold, careful glance you have given me since you were 17 years old." "Do not turn this into some grievance of your own," Simon said, though something in her raw, unexpected counter-accusation had already begun to unsettle his own certainty. "I have proof, Beatrice. I am not imagining this." Beatrice, exhausted from months of exactly the kind of careful, secret vigilance her own painful history had taught her to maintain, felt something in her own composure finally crack under the weight of Simon's accusation. "You believe I am trying to destroy your marriage," she said, her voice carrying a bitter, weary edge Simon had never once heard from her. "I have spent the better part of a year sacrificing my own reputation in this household, my own relationship with you, and a not inconsiderable portion of my own private funds to save it from a threat you know absolutely nothing about, because your wife came to me in genuine terror rather than to you, understanding, with rather better judgment than you are currently displaying, precisely how poorly you might handle the truth." "What truth?" Simon demanded, though something in Beatrice's raw, unguarded exhaustion had already begun, despite his own lingering suspicion, to unsettle the certainty of his accusation. Beatrice told him. Then, the whole of it, Margaret's youthful attachment to Vance, the compromising letters, the blackmail that had begun in the marriage's 3rd year, and continued, in careful secret, ever since, and her own desperate, hard-won efforts to neutralize the threat without ever once involving Simon directly, understanding, from her own devastating experience with her first husband, precisely how catastrophically a proud man's wounded reaction to such news might make an already dangerous situation considerably worse. "My first husband died because a similar threat was allowed to fester in silence and shame rather than being faced honestly," Beatrice said, her own composure finally, completely breaking. "I made a vow, watching him choose despair over confession, that I would never again let someone I cared for face such a threat alone if I had any power whatsoever to intervene. I could not tell you the truth, Simon, because I did not know whether you would respond with the same fierce protection your wife genuinely deserved, or with the same wounded, judgmental pride that has governed your opinion of me since the very day I married your father. I am only now discovering, watching your face as I tell you all this, precisely which of those two men you actually are." Simon stood in stunned, horrified silence, the whole of his year-long suspicion collapsing beneath the weight of a truth considerably more painful than any betrayal he had constructed in his own mind. "Where is Vance now?" he asked finally, his voice rough with a fury that had, in the space of a single devastating conversation, redirected itself entirely. "Considerably closer to a magistrate's cell than he realizes," Beatrice said. "I have spent these past months building a case against him for extortion, gathering testimony from at least 2 other women he has attempted the very same scheme against in years past, women who were willing, once I found them, to finally speak the truth, rather than continue suffering his threats in silence, the way I once watched my own husband suffer them alone. I intend to see him prosecuted fully, Simon, not merely paid off and sent away to threaten someone else eventually. I simply required rather more time than I would have liked to build the case properly. Time your own suspicion very nearly cost us before it could be completed." Simon found Margaret that same evening, and the confession that followed, delivered with a raw, frightened honesty Margaret had spent months dreading, was met not with the judgment she had feared, but with a fierce, immediate protectiveness that left her weeping with a relief considerably greater than any fear of exposure had ever produced. "You should have trusted me with this from the very beginning," Simon told her, holding her through the worst of her tears. "And I understand, watching how thoroughly my own pride has governed my judgment these past months, precisely why you did not believe you could. I intend to spend considerably more effort earning that trust going forward than I have apparently earned it thus far." Vance was arrested within the fortnight. Beatrice's carefully assembled case, strengthened considerably by Simon's own furious and now fully informed involvement, proving more than sufficient to secure a conviction that saw the man transported for his crimes, and the 2 additional women whose testimony Beatrice had gathered found themselves, for the first time in years, finally free of a threat they had each believed themselves powerless to escape alone. Simon spent the following months attempting, with a humility he had never once previously extended to his stepmother, to properly understand and honor the woman he had spent 8 years misjudging, learning, in careful, overdue conversations, the full truth of her own first husband's tragedy and the genuine, painful cost of the vow she had made in its aftermath. He asked her, in one such conversation, why she had never once told him the truth of Frederick Wells's death across the whole of their 8 years of acquaintance, and Beatrice answered, with a small, tired honesty, that she had never once believed he would ask, having decided long before the crisis with Vance that Simon's suspicion of her ran too deep to ever genuinely welcome the vulnerability of her own painful history. He restructured his father's old settlement to grant Beatrice considerably greater authority and independence within the household. An overdue correction of an arrangement he now understood had been built on his own father's misplaced suspicion rather than any genuine failing on Beatrice's part, and made a point, in the months that followed, of consulting her directly on matters of household management he had once handled entirely without her input. Small gestures of genuine trust that Beatrice, guarded by years of Simon's own cold distance, accepted at first with a wary hesitance that gradually, across the following year, warmed into something considerably closer to the genuine family bond neither of them had ever quite managed to build in the 8 years prior. Margaret and Beatrice, freed at last from the careful, painful distance the whole ordeal had required of them, rebuilt their own friendship with a warmth that surpassed even their earlier acquaintance, Margaret finding in Beatrice not merely a stepmother-in-law, but a genuine confidant who understood, from hard experience, precisely the kind of quiet courage her own confession had required. The household that emerged from the crisis bore a warmth between all 3 of them that none of them had genuinely expected to find on the other side of it. A warmth built not on the comfortable absence of conflict, but on the considerably harder, considerably more valuable foundation of a truth finally spoken aloud after years of careful, protective silence. If watching a man discover the person he believed his greatest enemy was actually his marriage's fiercest secret defender left you satisfied, you know exactly what to do. This channel is brand new, and every subscriber genuinely helps us keep telling stories like this one. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next release. Give this one a like if Beatrice deserved every bit of the trust she finally received. Share it with someone who loves a story about misjudged loyalty finally being seen clearly. And let me know in the comments the exact moment you suspected the stepmother wasn't actually the villain.